Welcome to Economy Disrupted. I'm Stephanie Segal, Senior Fellow with the Economics Program at CSIS. And this week, we're going to discuss economic policymaking at a time of crisis. And in the current context, I think it's fair to say multiple crises given the challenges the country currently faces. As you watch, you can submit your questions at the link below.
And I'm Matthew Goodman, Senior Vice President for Economics at CSIS and co-host of Economy Disrupted. Delighted you could join us for episode 7. We're going to speak with our guests for about 45 minutes, and then we're going to wrap up with our usual segment, The Bottom Line. Hope you can stick around for that. For today's guest, delighted to welcome Kevin Hassett, who is Vice President and Managing Director at the Lindsey Group. He's also a Distinguished Visiting Fellow at Stanford University and former chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors in the Trump White House. Welcome, Kevin.
Thanks, Matthew. It's great to be here.
Delighted to have you. So let me jump right in and ask you the first question. I'm going to start with a question or the topic that's on everyone's mind, which is the COVID-19 pandemic and its economic fallout. So having served for 2 years as CEH, as the chairman, you were then called back into service earlier this year to help with the response to the crisis. And it was widely reported that one of the things you did was to develop a model of the epidemiology of the pandemic that suggested a more sort of benign path than we've in fact seen. I don't want to relitigate that. I'm actually interested in the policymaking process. When I worked in the White House twice, I thought of the CEA economists as smart guys who were sitting there sort of quietly doing economic research, presenting the economic report to the president every year, but not really deeply engaged in the policy-making process. So I'm just interested in how you saw that. It sounds like your role was rather different.
Yeah, I think that certainly going back, that the role was quite a bit different. And, that Washington Post story, has been roundly criticized by lots of folks who know what was going on. The truth of the story was radically different from what they wrote. And indeed, I could criticize the Washington Post to say that it seems like that they're trying to attack the White House with everything they got, regardless of what the facts are, that they've been doing that for years. I can remember at one point, Scott Gottlieb and I spent a lot of time on the economics of prescription drugs early on in the administration. And basically the economics of it is that if you let a prescription drug in as a generic that's like just the second one, it doesn't have much of an effect on price. But if you let the third, fourth, fifth, sixth one be approved, then all of a sudden you get all this competition, so prices go down a lot. And so the FDA prioritized, because of the economics, having like the third, fourth, fifth, or sixth prescription drug approved. And then drug prices dropped radically. And you can go back, the consumer price index for drugs dropped for 2 years in a row for the first time since the Second World War. And I said that on TV, and then the president repeated it. And the Washington Post actually gave him 4 Pinocchios for saying that drug prices had dropped, even though it was like verifiable in the CPI. And so the same team of guys basically said that I had developed a model, which I never did. I never developed a model. But what we did do, why I was brought back in, is that I've been a very active data analyst and computer programmer since the start of my career. And there's a massive amount of real-time data analysis that had to be done because we were right in the middle of the fog of war. Right now, you can kind of go online and you can go to Google and you can see like what's up with cases, what's up with deaths, and you've got the Johns Hopkins service where you can go and look even at the county level and see what's going on. But back then in March, there was basically the potential for lots of data to be available to policymakers, but there really wasn't a facility to coordinate it all and just give them the answers. And so the president asked me, I was actually in Australia, you might recall, Matthew, Christy and I were in Australia, and they called up and said, you really got to fly back because we have a data emergency. That we're flying almost blind because we need to know stuff that the current government data facilities don't give us any clarity on. And so as an example of one of the things that we did, just about my first week there, it became apparent that there was this terrible constraint with ventilators. And I was on the horn with people in New York State quite a bit, where they were predicting that they would need, 30, 40,000 ventilators. We had about 10,000 ventilators in the federal stockpile. And, the kind of problem that came to my team was, okay, so how many ventilators do we have? Where are they? It just turned out there was nobody in government that knew that. But we noodled around. We found that Medicare has billing data where for every hospital in the country for Medicare, then they bill you for this or that. And then we also got on the horn to private insurers and said, we've got this emergency, we need more clarity, you need to let us have access to data. And then what we did is we estimated for every hospital in the country, about 6,000, how many ventilators were ever built in a day throughout all of history. And so if they had 50 ventilators built in a day, 6 months ago, then that was our estimate of the capacity of the ventilators for that hospital. Maybe they would have rotated somebody through, but it was like, so we suddenly had data on where the ventilators were. A week after that, we were coordinating efforts with governors all over the country to move the ventilators from the places that we found them and they weren't being used to the places where they needed them. And so that was the kind of structure that I got pulled into, which was really quite a bit different, as you said, as from CEA. But as for the did I build, when I first came in, one of the things that I saw was that the non-scientists in the White House and actually throughout government were just really annoyed and frustrated with the epidemiological models because they had been going all over the map. Like in February, there were some that were saying that there's going to be millions of deaths in the US and others that were saying that, it's going to be gone by April. There were scientists that were saying that as soon as it gets warm, it's probably going to go away just like the cold. You can remember what it was like back then. And so I decided to use basically standard econometric techniques to look at out of sample performance of the epidemiological models. So not to build my own epidemiological model, but to sort of look at other people's epidemiological models as sort of say, well, how did they do? So if I looked at what the University of Washington said a month ago about where we would be today, then, how'd they do? If I look at what they said 2 weeks ago about where we'd be today, then how'd they do? And so we started to score all the different epidemiological models by basically taking their forecasts and then just overlaying the data on top of it. And then looking to see, as their forecasts evolved, did it get closer and closer to the path of data that we actually observed? But if you look at the data, you'll see that it goes all over the place. There's one of the things that's really frustrating, and it's kind of a black mark on health data in the US, is if you notice that deaths and cases go way, way down every Sunday. But they don't, right? So what's going on is that somebody's supposed to be recording the death on a Sunday, but they're at home. They're not at the hospital or something, right? And so there's all this fluctuation of the data. And so what we did is we just smoothed through. And so it's definitely the case that as of the end of April, that the smooth through data were looking more optimistic than the more pessimistic epidemiological models. And so if you were just a person who was sort of saying, well, what should I think? How have they done? What do the data tell me? Then it's possible you could look at the smoothing and say, oh, it looks like it's going to be okay. But if you go back and look at my TV appearances throughout where, I was getting criticized for saying that we're going to have a Great Depression potentially and so on, then it's just completely inaccurate to say that I was an optimist about the path of the disease.
Well, that's really interesting. And I think also, sort of highlights the point that that the underlying analysis and there's still an important role in the White House for that kind of analysis. I mean, that the U.S. government doesn't have a full picture of some of these specific data and other trends. So it validates having brought you back. Let me shift a little bit in a follow-up to another dimension of kind of where analysis fits in, which is the jobs impact of the pandemic and how your advice fed into the sort of policy responses there. You've actually long held somewhat unconventional views, I think, on unemployment based on this testimony that was very well noted at the time back in about 2013, I think, to the Joint Economic Committee of Congress, where you talked about sort of a short-term jobs program to hire people directly into the government to do government work. That was a long time ago, but and employment, improved significantly after that. But now we've got this new hit, and so people are looking around for different solutions. The U.S. has largely focused on increasing unemployment insurance, providing loans to businesses, whereas other places like Europe have been more focused on incentivizing, companies to keep workers on the payroll and to support work sharing programs and so forth, which, by the way, I understand you've also supported in the past. I wonder kind of how your analysis fed into this whole question of the jobs response and and sort of any thoughts on how the US versus Europe versus others are responding to this on that front.
Sure, thanks. You know, there's a lot going on in the question. So first of all, just looking historically, my connection to work sharing goes back to the Great Recession, where I was at a friend's wedding of all things, and this person was a Wall Street investor, and he said to me, "Geez, the Great Recession is having a terrible GDP effect in the U.S. and in Germany, but in Germany the unemployment rate hasn't budged at all. You know, what's up with that?" And so I got on the horn, and having lived in Germany and attended the University of Hamburg, I was able to dig deep into the German literature on this in German. And I found out that they had this program called Kurzarbeit, which translates, I guess, into work sharing, but it's short time work, I guess, might be another way if you're going to be literalist, you might translate it. And I think that I was very instrumental back then in popularizing the idea that you should adopt a German-like program of work sharing. I worked closely with Senator Jack Reed of Rhode Island, a really terrific guy, to put a bill together that actually passed, where the federal government encourages and subsidizes work sharing. And the idea of work sharing is really, really simple. It's like, let's define the problem. The problem is that if you have, say, 99 weeks of unemployment insurance, then a lot of people will take the unemployment insurance and not go back to work until the 99 weeks are up. And then they'll have been separated from a job for 99 weeks. And there's ample evidence that if you're out of the workforce for a long time, it gets almost impossible to get a job. And so by creating this sort of big supply of long-term unemployed folks, which is what we did when we expanded the UI by extending the duration back during the Great Recession, then you might be making a really long-run problem of creating all this long-term unemployment of people who are separate from society, separate from the workforce. So what work sharing does is it gives you like a fractional unemployment insurance. And so if you are, if you like, you could reduce a worker's hours 20%. And then they could get 20% of their unemployment insurance to help replace that income. And so you don't have to separate a guy from the workplace in order to qualify them for UI. You can do it fractionally. And so the way you can call it work sharing is, instead of laying off one guy, you could reduce the hours 20% for 5 guys and, you know, use the same unemployment insurance, but keep people connected to the workforce. And so that became law way back then. But very few states, except for Rhode Island and a few others, really aggressively pursued it. And it's still on the books, but it certainly is something that should be expanded, especially if this recession extends, you know, deep into next year. And if it does extend deep into next year, then the question is that you start to run into this problem that if people are out of the workforce for, say, a year or more, then they become long-term unemployed and they have increased risk of all sorts of problems like depression, opioid addiction, and so on. And it gets much, much harder to get them reemployed. And so I think that if you sort of think about, you know, the challenge, the labor market challenge of a long recession, then having government employment programs be part of the solution is a good, solid idea. And a final thought on that is that it's a lot more expensive to create a job by, say, building a bridge to create jobs than it is to hire somebody. Right? So if you want us to go, I want to, you know, make 500 jobs, I'm going to build a bridge, right? Then you're going to end up spending, you know, a few $1 million a job to indirectly create jobs by building a bridge. But if you hire someone and find something productive for them to do, and especially now in the time of COVID, I'm sure there's a lot of stuff that we could have people do to help those in need, then it could be a much more efficient way to make sure we don't create a long-term unemployment problem.
All right. I would just note today there was some reporting on I think it was a Goldman note that came out today suggesting that up to a quarter of the job losses from the pandemic in the US could be permanent. So it does feel, based on kind of the research that's been done thus far and the knowledge of what sectors are getting hit hardest by the pandemic, that we could be facing some of these long-term structural issues. So I think more energy and more thinking on this topic is definitely going to be needed. If I could switch gears to fiscal policy, and just thinking about Matt's question to you and your thinking about how you make forecasts for really unknown circumstances and situations. I want to ask you about the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act of 2017. So this was legislation that was signed into law in December of 2017. And one big feature of that was cutting the corporate tax rate from 35 to 21%. And at the time, the rationale for that was that it would actually spur economic growth. And I think you were on record referencing the wage gains, the investment gains, and ultimately the GDP gains, which in fact did come to pass in 2018. Moving into 2019, though, we saw something different. In particular, we saw investment, the rate of growth in investment drop, and we also saw GDP come back closer to that 2% level. And some saw that as evidence that what we saw in 2018 was more of a kind of response, a sugar high, basically. And then by 2019, we were back to the historical path for GDP growth, or at least recent history. So how do you respond to that? I guess have we disproven, I guess, from the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, the belief that tax cuts alone can really fuel higher rates of economic growth?
No, in fact, what happened went exactly as planned, or at least according to the models. And the way to think about it is that if I invest $1 this year, then it makes the capital stock grow, which will make GDP grow. If the extra dollar of investment is bigger than depreciation, right? Because so if you have a machine and then if there's some wear and tear, and so if it takes sort of $1 to repair it so that it's back to where it was at the start of the year, then when you invest $1, you don't get any capital stock growth. You don't get any growth, from the capital stock into GDP, because your investment is just basically treading water. It's replacing depreciation. And so what happens in the economic models that we use to study tax policy is that investment is a function of all the tax variables. And if you cut the tax variables, then investment jumps. And so that if you start in like a long run steady state, then investment is just equal to depreciation. And then if you cut taxes, then investment jumps to a new level. So say instead of investing $1 a year, we invest $1.50 a year. And now the capital stock goes up by 50 cents because we needed $1 to counteract depreciation. And then we got the 50 cents in capital stock growth, which can turn into GDP growth. And so what happens, what you would expect to see if the tax policy worked the way we thought, is that the level of investment would jump right at the beginning and then stay at the higher level. And then the capital stock would grow and give you more and more GDP over time. And there's one technical detail that sort of makes you have to account for, which I've seen some analysts fail to, which is that the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, it's true that it really took off in 2018. But when it was being legislated, they said that the corporate tax expensing of investment would be retroactive to October. And so what happened was that once people kind of knew it was going to pass, let's say it's November, that if you bought a machine in November, then you could expense it at 35 cents, 35%, because that's what the corporate rate still was. And then if you bought it in January, you'd expense it at 21%. And so you got a much bigger tax advantage to invest right before the law was enacted, actually, because of the retroactivity in the law. And so we saw this huge spike right before the law was enacted in investment, which is exactly what theory would say. Then it went up a little bit from there and then stayed at a high level, and capital stock grew and wages grew. And so the wage growth that we saw was just about what we expected. In fact, it was actually a little bit faster than expected. I think that the income, I'd have to get the latest number because we have had such a big decline right in the second quarter, but incomes were up, very close to the $4,000 that we thought would happen over 5 years already into. And so I'd say it worked just about the way we expected. Yeah.
Yeah, we did also see, though, record levels of stock buybacks, which I think was the concern at the time, that companies might use that that retained income, not for investment, but for stock buybacks, which does seem to at least be part of the story. And at the end of the day, you are targeting GDP growth. And that's where, regardless of where we saw investment going, we saw GDP kind of falling back closer to 2%. And I think that's the question, I guess, is whether or not it's possible to get to that 3% or more rate of growth just through tax cuts.
Sure. I mean, I think we were going to have 3% the first quarter of this year before COVID came in, if you looked at all the data early on. I think the repurchase point is an interesting one because it's a sort of common misconception about how to think about the tax cut effects, that there are really two effects. One is on the stock and one is on the flow. And so we have all these companies like Apple and the big drug companies that had all this cash overseas, and it was stuck in Irish subsidiaries. And because we were going to charge them this really high 35% tax if they mailed the money home to pay it out as a dividend or repurchase shares or use it for investment, they just left it over there in Ireland. And then because of the tax cuts, that sort of 2 to 4 trillion home, then there's like this stock of cumulative past profits that suddenly firms could give back shareholders without having a really high tax liability. And that's different from the sort of incentive effect of the user cost of capital that we talked about previously when we were comparing it to depreciation. And so that's more of a flow that should happen at a different pace than the cumulative 2 to 4 trillion of cash that was offshore before. But yes, I think for sure we were, I'd have to go back and look at what we were saying in December, but you have to remember that when I took over at the CEA, all the growth forecasts from the CBO and the Fed and from the previous CEA were saying that growth was we were in a new normal and growth was really in the ones, and it was headed that way over a decade. And then because the deregulation and the tax cuts and whatever else, perhaps some exogenous factors too, made growth will go a lot higher, that everybody jacked up their growth forecasts for the whole decade. So if you go back and compare the CBO forecast from 2016 to the one right before COVID started, then you could see that they probably increased their estimate for GDP 10 years out by a few $1 trillion. So I think that there was a lot of positive news from policy.
Well, and another reason beyond kind of what the resulting GDP might be, that folks are really focused on fiscal policy right now. And the last episode we did of Economy Disrupted focused on debt sustainability and our fiscal position. Coming out of this crisis, when we do come out of the health crisis, we're going to be left with record levels of public debt. And there's a question, I guess, of what are the policies to get us back in track as far as fiscal sustainability goes. So I guess a two-part question there. One, do you share these concerns about our long-term debt and fiscal sustainability? And I guess depending on that answer, what is the right kind of mix of policies on the revenue and expenditure side to achieve that sustainability?
Yeah, thanks for that. So that you're right, the debt levels are really obscenely high, and that's a policy challenge for whichever party controls government going forward. And what will definitely have to happen, hopefully sooner rather than later, is what the term of art, what economists call a fiscal consolidation, which is where the government basically looks at all of its sort of future assets and liabilities and tries to align them better. The fact is, right now, if you're thinking, well, let's suppose that the COVID crisis ends, and then an investor has to think, geez, should I be optimistic about the future of the American economy? And you see this massive deficit, then you start to think, well, geez, maybe they're going to cut spending a lot, in which case, that'll reduce GDP. And so maybe they'll have a recession from cutting the spending, or maybe they're going to increase taxes a lot, in which case the higher taxes are going to depress growth and maybe give us a recession from the higher taxes. And so either way, it doesn't look so good, right? And so the lesson from the literature, Alberto Alesina at Harvard was one of the earlier contributors to it, is that once you reach a state where your debt level is so high that like a reasonable person would look at it and say, geez, I wonder how they're going to work this out. Then if you fix it, it could actually have positive growth effects. because there's kind of like this sigh of relief effect. It's like, oh, well, actually, they're not crazy. They understand that they need to fix it. Matt Jensen at AEI and I wrote a review of the literature on fiscal consolidation a few years ago. And I'm sure if anyone Googles Kevin Hassett, Matt Jensen, fiscal consolidation, they'll see it right away. And so what we did is we looked at a really large sample of across countries of countries that had pursued fiscal consolidations over time. And what we did, the purpose of our paper was to look at the consolidations and divide them into two groups, consolidations that worked and consolidations that didn't work. And the metric that we used for whether it worked or not was what they said their own objective was when they passed the consolidation. And so you know how if you passed a bill in Congress, then the CBO will say something like, this will reduce the deficit by $1 trillion over 10 years or something like that. And so then we look to see, well, did the deficit actually go down by $1 trillion? And so we did that with a big sample across country of, I forget exactly how many fiscal consolidations, but dozens. And we found that the cut government spending or entitlements by about 80% of the change and increased taxes by about 20%. And that the consolidations that relied more on tax revenue tended not to work because the politicians used the extra revenue to, do what politicians do, build bridges that they name after their uncles or whatever. But so that the access to the higher revenue made them less disciplined with regard to spending. But once they had actually agreed to cut spending, which is hard to do, then it tended to be credible and they would do it. And so for me, I would think you'd have to think about clever ways to reform Social Security and Medicare and do it, obviously in a progressive way to restore some kind of long-run solvency. But if you don't go after the entitlements, then you're not going to get anywhere.
I'm sure there's a lot more to discuss on that. We could do the rest of the program and several others just on that. But let me try and shift gears a little bit and talk to you about trade. I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that you've for a long time been an avid supporter of free trade. But that's not a popular position on either side of the aisle in Washington these days. And in fact, protectionist pressure, if anything, has been building up with people seeing the inadequacy of our supply chains for critical medical equipment and so forth. But even before the pandemic, you had growing concerns that the benefits of trade were not being distributed evenly, where CEOs and managers were getting a lot of the benefit of the profitability of global supply chains and offshoring, and workers were losing their jobs and not getting that benefit, except as consumers, of course. But that leads really to the question: how do you make the case for trade in this environment against those headwinds? And are you worried about this backlash against trade? Is it in terms of just the impact on growth?
Yeah, that's another really deep dive question, and especially here at CSIS that you've got the world's leading experts on these topics. In fact, you're probably the most relevant guy for the big problem, which is China. We're going to
get to that.
Yeah, I know, but I'll just sort of say that I think that there's a lot of weird stuff that goes on in trade policy, and the economists. When we talk about free trade, then we have trade models where trade is one sentence in the model, and the trade deals are thousands of pages of special rules about this and that, and so the trade space is a very convoluted one. But I don't think that I think that the benefits of free trade clearly dominated the costs until China entered the WTO, and then I think that. There are economists, Otter at MIT, Schott, Peter at Yale, that have looked at the sort of disruptive effect of Chinese mills shutting down American mills, and then mill towns sort of turning into pockets of despair and so on, and that basically you could start to feel it politically in the U.S. where Barack Obama. One of his main topics in the primaries where he disagreed with Mrs. Clinton was NAFTA. You might recall he deeply critical of NAFTA because of all of the harm it had caused to folks. And I think that there are a lot of economists, especially conservative economists, who sort of poo-pooed harm, but that if you look at the overwhelming literature now, that it's just massive, the disruption from China entering the WTO. And, I, when I got to the White House, dug even more into things like intellectual property theft. And you guys probably saw the report that we put out, the White House, the CEA on that. And I even got to the point where, while I was still at the White House, that I would even advocate it now, that I think that probably they should kick China out of the WTO. That it's basically just such a miscreant. That it's stealing everybody's IP. It's subsidizing competitors and putting competitors out of business. And that they they're a challenge to the World Trade Organization, to the World Trading System, because they just don't play by any rules. And again, when you're in the White House, you get privy to intelligence on things that are going on that can be pretty, I guess, startling. But there's a lot of public stuff too, like about the solar panel stuff and the Chinese theft of all the IP in the solar panel industry, and then they sort of put all the problem with trade really is not that big a deal in terms of the net effects on growth until you get like a big misbehavior. And the challenge of trade going forward is what do we do with that?
So, I have a follow-up, but Stephanie, you were going to ask a question about China. Do you want to ask a follow-up on that? And
yeah, I would, Kevin, and you were kind of alluding to it there. As far as what is shaping the U.S.-China relationship right now, I think at the start of the Trump administration, it was clear that there was tension in the relationship, but I think it was largely viewed as around economic issues. And I think you had even mentioned in one of your press appearances that there was great upside if we could get China to play by the rules, and great upside for both countries if China could play by the rules and be reciprocal as far as how it was treating U.S. companies. But if you listen to senior members of the administration now, it doesn't sound like it's purely an economic issue. It seems to go much deeper than that, and questioning whether or not the U.S. can even engage with China, or at least with the Chinese Communist Party. So what's you have been in a position where you can actually hear kind of what is the end objective or the ultimate objective of how we engage with China. Can you say a little bit about that and how much it actually goes beyond just the pure economic?
Right. Well, first, with respect to the China trade deal, I when I speak to my friends who are still watching it every day, everybody feels like China is adhering to it quite aggressively, that they're trying to keep that deal alive. But at the same time, we've got what's going on in Hong Kong, we've got what's going on with the Uyghurs in the South China Sea, reports about the kind of human rights violations associated with the way the Chinese appear to be testing COVID vaccines even. I mean, their behavior is not the kind of behavior that you would sort of want an ally to engage in. And so I think that their behavior has gotten worse and worse since the Trump administration began, and that there's a big crackdown going on right now, and that who knows where it's going to end. But I think that it's not really necessarily just the trade story. It might not even be the trade story, the economic story at all that's most relevant. And indeed, in the trade space, they seem to they're kind of playing nice, I think, right now, because there's so much else that's going on that is more important to them.
Well, there's a lot, again, to follow up there on both China and on trade generally. I hope there's a question that's come in that we may get back to that sort of touches on some of this. But I just don't want to not ask you about another topic, which you've also actually been ahead of your time on, which is climate change and the response to that. That's another big disruptive force that we're going to have an episode on in this series. I think back in 2007, maybe earlier, but that was the earliest thing I could find where you were talking about this in a paper with some of your AEI colleagues. And you actually, among other things, proposed a carbon tax or an approach to carbon taxation that was interesting, a controversial idea even today. Just wonder, three-part question: do you still think a carbon tax is a good idea? How would you structure that? How would you calculate it so that it was fair to especially to low-income households? And would you, related question, would you favor a carbon a border tax to equalize or to offset the disadvantage to U.S. firms from other from the treatment of products from other countries?
Yeah, thanks. First, I think that if you were to ask anyone, it certainly goes back to the first thing we talked about, Matthew, where, geez, all of a sudden I'm leaving Australia and going back into the White House and running a data operation in an emergency for zero salary, by the way, right, as a volunteer.
Thank you for your service, really.
The fact is that we were really underprepared for the pandemic. At CEA, we wrote an article the fall before, about a year ago, about pandemics and the risk and how we're underprepared for it. But I think that everybody would agree that the government wasn't well prepared. And I think that just one president, it's like a cumulative problem that's built up over time. And I think that the reason why we're underprepared for the pandemic is that it goes back even to the question about the debt and the deficit, that, politics is so short-sighted that we tend to sort of disregard rare risks. And I think that, one thing, sort of mathematically, a rare event like getting hit by an asteroid or a volcano exploding or a pandemic, that a rare event you could think of as something that's got, say, a 1 in 100 chance of happening, and so over 100 years you're probably going to see one. Climate change is probably a little bit different from a rare event, like philosophically, in the sense that it's not necessarily so low probability, but the real harm is probably farther off in the distance. And so at expected value, I think a rare event and climate change are very, very similar. And so I think that to the extent that Americans recognize, which I think they should, that we haven't thought nearly carefully enough about how to prepare for rare catastrophic events, should increase the demand for thinking about, well, what should we do to prepare for the possible negative events associated with climate change? And so, one of the carbon tax. I think my first paper was 92 on a carbon tax. I was, and that paper with Gib Metcalf, who's a well-known economist in the space, we looked at exactly at your question, Matthew, and then we followed up 3 or 4 times to update it, which is like, if we had a carbon tax, what would the incidence of it be? And we had a surprising result, which has been replicated a number of times. But it's that a carbon tax is actually about neutral, might even be slightly progressive, which is surprising to folks. And the reason is that when you consume energy, which the price of it goes up a lot if you have a carbon tax, at $25 a ton, you get about a 10% increase, say, in the price of heating oil and gasoline, about an 85% increase in the price of coal, something like that. And so energy gets more expensive, electricity too. And so since poor people consume more energy as a share of their total consumption because the gasoline bill and the home heating bill and stuff like that, then the direct incidence of the carbon tax looks very regressive. But indirectly, wealthy people are more likely to take an airplane or have a titanium golf club or, things that are very, very energy intensive. So if you want to do the incidence of a carbon tax, you need to look at the direct and the indirect effect. And so the direct effect is regressive, the indirect effect is very progressive because rich people are taking airplanes and so on. And so if you combine the two, then the distributional effect is about neutral or maybe even slightly progressive. And so I've always said, and I've said this for many, many years, that Greta, God bless her soul, is right, that people aren't really serious about climate change, and that's true of people on the left and on the right. And if we go to an asteroid as an example, so suppose that I think there's an asteroid that's going to hit the Earth, and that it's going to destroy us, and that we need to spend lots of money to send Bruce Willis out there to save us or whatever. But you, Matthew, think, oh, Kevin, you're crazy. There's no asteroid coming. Well, if I really believe it, then what I would do is I would say, well, fine, Matthew, I know you don't agree, but tell me what you want, and I'll let you have that, but let me save us from the asteroid, right? That's the kind of deal that would happen. But we've never reached that point here in the U.S. The way it would look So let's just say that there are a lot of Republicans, although not all of them, who wonder whether we need to act now, and then a lot of Democrats who are sure that we need to. Well, the people who are sure we need to act now should go to the people who wonder, and they should say, what's it going to take, right? And against that backdrop, if you give me a carbon tax and then let me change other taxes that are much more economically harmful, a carbon tax is a pretty efficient tax. And so we've got some taxes that cause a lot of economic harm and some don't. And if you give me the revenue from a carbon tax and let me jigger some other taxes, then I could increase economic growth irrespective of the effect on climate change. And the fact that sort of Democrats haven't gone to Republicans and said, hey, let's use the carbon tax revenue to, you do with it what you want. but I want to go after climate change, and you do that growth thing that you supply siders believe in. Then you could have a deal. But I would still 100% support such a deal where if you took carbon tax and recycled the revenue to reduce highly distortionary taxes, then you could make
Kevin, I think you broke up at least on my end from Zoom, so I didn't want to cut off your concluding thought there. I would say the one caveat maybe to what you said, I think the United States is unique in the sense that up until very recently, there wasn't agreement on the fact that there was an issue with climate. So you might have one side going to the other with a proposed solution, but if the other side isn't necessarily agreeing that there's an issue to be dealt with, you'd be challenged to make progress, I think. But if I turn now to the questions that we received, actually quite a few on a few of the things that we've already discussed here on some of the fiscal issues, but also a few related to China, if I could just pick back up on that, and actually a very specific question that we received, which was whether the Trump administration, not that you can speak for them now, but given your background, if the Trump administration would support a free trade agreement with like-minded partners, including Taiwan, if Taiwan's government solves the existing trade issues. So any thoughts on the prospects for an agreement with Taiwan?
Yeah, I think, well, specifically with Taiwan, I don't have any information, but I think a turning point in trade policy in the administration happened when Larry Kudlow was with the president at a G7 or a G20 meeting, and they got to talking about this issue, and Larry said, look, you're right about the way that these other countries are imposing tariffs on us and not opening their markets to us, and that our trade deals are asymmetric. We've kind of unilaterally disarmed. But if we could get them agreed to zero non-tariffs barriers unilaterally, would you do that? And the president said yes. And so I think that to a wide open trade deal where you're basically just saying, yeah, let's just get rid of all barriers, that the president would take it.
I wonder if he knows the size of our trade deficit with Taiwan, but that's probably a separate issue.
Separate question. Look, there are so many good questions. There are actually a lot on the debt question, but let me not ask that one. Let me ask you something that we haven't really gotten into, which is the interesting question about how the car culture historically has been so important to the economy of the U.S. And now everybody's working from home, although they still seem to be buying cars, which is interesting, but that's another story. I think the core of this person's question is, what impact do you see on the economy due to this change of working culture and the increase of digital technology, on real estate values, corporate and residential, the digital economy generally, what the impact of that is, and how do you think about that in terms of economic analysis going forward?
Yeah, thanks. I think that in the car space, there's something going on that's under-remarked upon, which is that if you go back, really early internet days, and you look at right when Google started, that, Google's search algorithm is mathematically not like it's more sophisticated now, but the original one wasn't that sophisticated, but it just used the sort of knowledge it could acquire from its own users and the searches that they made and the things that they clicked on to help the next user who searched on that thing. And then they ended up with this massive scale economy because everybody went to Google because it was better, and then they got better and better because everybody went to Google. I think that something like that is about to happen in the car industry with Tesla, because we are really, really close, like maybe a year from being able to have fully automated self-driving cars everywhere in the country. But to do that, you basically need AI and machine learning and a massive database. And Tesla's got all these cars out there collecting the data you need to have really good self-driving cars. And there really isn't any other company that is going to be able to compete. They're using like really archaic systems compared to what Tesla is. And so Tesla's got like the big data scale advantage that say Google had. And I think they're going to take over the car industry relatively quickly, and that people aren't going to be driving their cars very much at all, that the cars are going to be driving themselves. And so that's like one big change to the car industry I see happening. But I think that the question is right, that to the extent that the 21st century workplace is sort of coming at us quicker than we thought because of COVID, then that's going to make us move around a lot less and probably make our cars a lot less important to us. But right now, the data, as you said, are actually pretty interesting. The inventories are really low. I expect car production in the near term to be a big.
Right. Interesting. Stephanie, we were really almost out of time, but Oh, I'm sorry, Kevin. I thought you were done. Carry on.
I was just going to say that if you have a Tesla that self-drives, then one car can serve a lot more people. So that I was going to finish by converging the two lines of argument, because you could go to work and then instead of having the Tesla sit in the garage for 8 hours while you're at work, it can go around and like be like an Uber and give other people rides instead of sitting in the garage. And so car utilization could end up being a lot more efficient. We'd have fewer cars as well.
Interesting. Brave new world. Stephanie, can we sneak one more in?
Let me kind of merge a few of these questions together. So there's some skepticism here that the way to fiscal sustainability is through entitlement reform, but I'd like to maybe combine that question with what you just mentioned, Kevin, about some big structural changes that we might see that could also result in higher levels of unemployed for longer. And how do you kind of reconcile entitlement reform, social spending reform, with the fact that we might have more Americans needing additional support from the government?
Yeah, so again, an example, let's think of, not to pick one favorite, but let's think of some examples that right now, Social Security is indexed for wage growth, not for price growth. And so one reason why Social Security is sort of bankrupt in the long run is that we expect wages to grow a lot over, say, the next 20, 30, 40 years. And so that the Social Security benefit in real terms that people get 30 or 40 years from now is going to be many times higher than the Social Security benefit people get today in real terms. And so what that means is that people with very high incomes are going to be getting really, really rich benefits. We're promising them really, really rich benefits. People with low incomes are getting rich benefits, but not really, really rich benefits. And so what you could do is you could reduce the benefit at the top and save a lot of money by changing the indexing, once you get to a certain point from wage growth to price growth. So you would lock in today's real benefit, but not have it grow with wages forever. Another proposal that could address like the kind of near-term things that we're talking about is that if you agreed to retire when you retire 40 years from now or whatever, a year later, then you could save the government a lot of money off in the future, because they're going to have to pay you 1 year less Social Security. So the government could compensate you today for agreeing to that bargain. And so we've run the numbers on a lot of different proposals, but if you could pay someone like $20,000 to agree to retire a year later, and they're 30 today. And so instead of going at 65, they go at 66, and the government could come out way ahead, and people would have more money today, which would help stimulate the economy when it's weak. And so that's the kind of clever policy that you need on the Social Security side. On Medicare, it's basically, in the end, it's like a progressive deductible is in the end how they're going to do it. And so they're going to say, hey, if your retirement income is above X, then the first, $20,000 of health expenditures or $10,000 of health expenditures, I don't know what the number is, will be out of pocket. But if your income's below that, then it'll be the same program that we have today. And so that's the kind of thing that would address the balance plus the fairness that you discussed.
Well, there's a lot more to discuss on that and on the many other topics that we didn't get to. Thank you to the questioners for those great series of questions, and we're sorry we couldn't get to everything. But let me say, unfortunately, we have to end there. But thank you so much, Kevin, for giving such thoughtful answers to such a wide array of topics, and we really appreciate it. And thank you for coming on and joining us. And before we end, we're going to do our usual segment of the bottom line. And we've got a special guest this time from Australia. This is our effort to look at other disruptive forces and how others are dealing with them. And we're delighted to have Gordon de Brouwer, who is in Canberra, and he is a senior advisor to our program, the CSIS Economics Program. He's held a number of senior roles in the Australian government. He was the head of the Energy and Environment Department in his last job, but he was also G20 Sherpa, and he's a brilliant economist and a good friend. Gordon's going to discuss the Australian policy response to COVID-19, which has been hit pretty hard by the crisis. By the way, their growth is expected to drop 6% in 2020, and effective unemployment is above 12%. So they have not been immune from this, even though they've had sort of 30 years of positive growth. So with that, I want to thank you all again. Thank you, Kevin. And now we'll go to the bottom line.
Thank you for the invitation to follow Kevin Hassett on economic policy in a time of crisis. My name is Gordon de Brouwer, and I'll talk a little bit about Australia's experience with the pandemic. Economic triage policies have been really important from the start, and they've ranged from a range of income support for workers and unemployed and older people, through wage subsidies and other benefits, through to some of the regulatory changes to support firms and keep them going, be that in the antitrust, workplace relations or insolvency domains, as well as working with banks and landlords to ease some of those cost requirements on firms. In thinking about recovery, been very clear that you can't get economic recovery without people being confident in the health system and in the health side. So the economy and health are not alternatives, they really have to go together. In thinking about the priorities for, say, infrastructure spending or for other spending or regulatory change, that's been important to focus on where we can gain some of the changes that have been underway, that have been accelerated by the pandemic, especially digitisation, use of big data and changing work practices. It's been also important to focus on some of those pre-existing problems, particularly around low productivity growth and low wages growth, and focus then on building up human capital and skills and the creation of new firms. And that also ensures that some of the human capital damage done by this crisis is maybe shorter lived. Also been a focus there on the people who are particularly hard hit by the pandemic. And in Australia, that's really in our casualised workforce. That's younger people and women in particular, and making sure that the impacts on them are mitigated and the long-term impacts are reduced. I think we've realised that this crisis is as much a social dimension as a social dimension, and that goes really to trust in public institutions. One of the great things the government's done is set up a national cabinet where the Prime Minister works directly with the heads of the state and territory governments in finding health and economic solutions. That's been a really big success and has had a really deep impact on people's trust actually in government and in public institutions. And we really want that to continue.